Welcome to my channel, a place where every mystery hides a story, and every story hides a truth. In the midst of forgotten streets, footsteps echo through the silence, and the faint glow of a lamp guards secrets that refuse to die. Every clue matters. A torn letter, a fading footprint, even the sound of a clock ticking in the dark. Here, doubt becomes a puzzle, and puzzles lead us to the heart of the unknown. So prepare your mind, watch closely, and listen carefully, because the shadows are speaking, and the truth is waiting to be found. This is where every case begins. Welcome to my channel. Asterisk.
Chapter 1. The watch with a paper heart hit was in the early spring of 1893, a season unusually dry and brittle in London, when a singularly baffling incident occurred which, at the time, drew little attention from the public, but would eventually prove to be one of the most quietly disturbing cases in Mr. Sherlock Holmes' singular career. I had returned that morning from a fortnight in Bath, where I had been attending to a long-standing patient. Upon my arrival at Baker Street, I found Holmes seated cross-legged in his chair, a Turkish slipper balanced precariously on one knee, and a cloud of pale smoke curling from the meerschaum pipe clamped between his teeth. "You appear to have walked through Victoria Station, avoided the Cabranc deliberately, and caught the 8:02 from Paddington, only to return here by foot, despite the clear weather," he said, without glancing up. "Remarkable," I murmured, slipping off my coat, "and correct on every count. I assume the soot upon my boots betrayed the detour through the station yard, and the slight dampness in my left trouser cuff suggests I brushed against the puddle outside the telegraph office." "You're improving, Watson," he said with a faint smile, "though you still fail to notice that your luggage has been handled by someone recently discharged from hospital, judging by the faint antiseptic traces on your trunks." Handle. Before I could press him on the matter, there came a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face drawn with concern. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Quite pale, sir, and trembling something awful." "Show him in, by all means," Holmes replied, his languid manner sharpening slightly. The visitor who entered was a man of perhaps 60 years, dressed plainly, but with a neatness that suggested former prosperity. His cheeks were hollow, and his greying hair clung damply to his temples. He held a closed umbrella with both hands, though the morning was perfectly dry. "My name is Elijah Drexler," he said in a wavering voice. "I believe I am in some peril, Mr. Holmes. I have come because of a watch." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite. "What kind of watch, Mr. Drexler?" The man opened his coat and produced a small object wrapped in brown paper. With trembling fingers, he removed the wrapping to reveal an old-fashioned hunter's watch. Its casing was scratched and dented, but what caught my attention was that its face had been replaced. Instead of numerals or hands, behind the glass lay a neatly cut paper heart, pale pink, folded perfectly to size, and slightly yellowed at the edges. "It arrived by post yesterday morning," Drexler whispered. "No return address, no note, just the watch." "And that?" Holmes leaned forward with sudden interest. "And the mechanism?" "Broken, sir, utterly. The second I touched the crown, it clicked, and stopped altogether. I took it to a jeweler. He told me the mainspring had been purposefully removed." Holmes turned the watch over delicately in his hands. "And this means something to you, I presume?" Drexler hesitated. "It might. You see, 40 years ago, I was engaged to a young woman named Lillian Hargreaves. She gave me a watch, not this one, but very like it, with a paper heart inside, as a kind of joke. It was her idea of romance, but we quarreled over nothing, truly, and one evening she disappeared, vanished from her lodgings, without a note or word. There were whispers that I had driven her away, that perhaps something worse had occurred, but nothing was ever proven." I felt a chill settle over the room. Holmes' eyes gleamed. "And this watch resembles hers in every detail," Drexler said quietly, "but it cannot be hers, Doctor. That watch was buried with her." I started. "Then she was found?" He shook his head. "No, Doctor. I had a headstone made at Kensal Green, a symbolic grave. There was no body." For a few moments, silence stretched between us. Then Holmes rose, crossed to the window, and looked out onto Baker Street. "And yet this arrived," he said softly. "A watch with a paper heart, from a woman long thought dead." He turned abruptly. "Watson, we leave for Kensington at once. Mr. Drexler, you will accompany us." There is something in this, something about the timing, the nature of the object, and something else I cannot yet define. He held the paper heart up to the light. Faint creases crossed it, as though it had been once folded into a note. "Let us pay our respects to the grave," Holmes murmured, "and perhaps unearth something more than memories." Thus began the case of the watch, with a paper heart, a case which would lead us into long-forgotten alleys, dusty correspondence, and the secrets of a vanished woman whose silence had echoed for 4 decades. Watson would record every moment. Holmes, I suspect, had already begun to listen to the ticking of a crime that had stopped time itself. Chapter 2. The symbolic grave. The journey to Kensal Green was subdued. Holmes sat upright in the corner of the cab, absently toying with the broken watch in his gloved hands. Elijah Drexler, his shoulders hunched and eyes fixed on some distant memory, spoke only when directly addressed. As for myself, I studied both men closely, one haunted by the past, the other already following some invisible thread toward its conclusion. "Tell me, Mr. Drexler," Holmes said at last, "who else was aware of this particular tradition between you and Miss Hargreaves, the paper heart? I mean..." Drexler blinked, startled from his reverie. "No one, to my knowledge. It was a private exchange between us. Lillian had a rather whimsical nature. She liked symbols, secrets hidden in plain sight. The watch was never shown to anyone else." "Curious," Holmes murmured. "And was there any effort made to trace her whereabouts after her disappearance?" "An investigation was launched, yes," Drexler said warily, "but her belongings were found intact at her boarding house. No sign of struggle, nor farewell note. Merely her absence. Scotland Yard had little interest after a fall. She was a grown woman, after all, and such vanishings, regrettable as they are, do occur." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And you?" "I searched for her tirelessly," he said, "for nearly a year. I paid for notices in the papers, visited every poorhouse and asylum within a day's ride. Eventually, I accepted she was gone. Her parents, her father, rather blamed me bitterly. He died not long after, a broken man." Holmes glanced toward the window, the watch clutched lightly between his fingers. "And yet someone, after 4 decades, seeks to summon the past with unsettling precision." Kensal Green Cemetery lay still beneath a pale sky, its winding paths and lichen-stained monuments lending the place an air of forgotten sorrow. "We found Lillian Hargreaves' grave near the western wall, tucked between 2 stone angels whose wings had begun to crumble from age and soot. The inscription was simple: Lillian Hargreaves, born 1852, vanished 1873. She wandered beyond our reach." Holmes examined the headstone with keen eyes. He knelt and ran his hand lightly along the edge of the plot, where the earth bore no sign of recent disturbance. "This is indeed a symbolic grave," he said at last. "No burial took place." Drexler nodded. "Only a service. I saw to it myself." Holmes rose, brushing dust from his knees. "And yet someone has come here recently." He pointed to the edge of the marble base. Faint impressions lingered in the thin moss, a series of scuffed marks, as though a heavy bag or box had been briefly rested there. "Not a mourner's step," Holmes observed, "but the deliberate pause of one making an offering." I looked about. "No flowers or ribbons." "Holmes, no," he replied softly, "because the offering was sent elsewhere." His gaze drifted back toward the watch, now resting in his palm. "The postmark, Clerkenwell," Drexler answered. "Yesterday morning." Holmes gave a short nod. "Then Clerkenwell it is." As we turned to leave, Holmes paused again at the headstone. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small magnifier from his pocket. "Watson, have a look here." I leaned closer. Just below the chiseled inscription, barely visible, was a tiny scratch in the marble, too shallow to be vandalism, yet too deliberate to be natural. The mark resembled a letter, though incomplete. "An unfinished R," I guessed. "Possibly," Holmes said. "Or the tail of an ampersand. Either way, it suggests recent contact. Someone leaned against this stone, possibly holding something, and made the mark." Drexler turned pale. "Are you suggesting that someone visited this grave, marked it, and then sent me the watch deliberately?" "Not just someone," Holmes replied. "Someone with knowledge of your history, and more importantly, someone who believes the story is not yet finished." Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat silently for some time. The watch lay open on the table beside him, the paper heart turned gently beneath the gaslight. He had taken the glass off with careful hands, examining the heart's edges for glue or ink, but found nothing. I had just poured tea when he spoke again. "There's something else here, Watson," something buried in the construction of this gesture. He stood abruptly, disappearing into his bedroom. Moments later, he returned with a slender cardboard tube. From it, he withdrew an old railway map of London and its environs, stained with years of use. Clerkenwell, he said, pointing to the district, and Kensal Green. He traced a line between them with his finger. And if you extend the vector eastward, it points toward Limehouse, I said. The docks, exactly. The geography suggests a deliberate route west to east, memory to message. This was not merely a ghost from the past. This was choreography. He turned toward Drexler. Tell me, sir, who would have wanted you to suffer for what happened to Miss Hargreaves? Not Mornsep. Drexler hesitated. Her father, certainly, but he'd been dead for years. Beyond him, I don't know. She had no siblings. Her mother passed when she was young. There was a friend, Miss Agatha a boarding mate. Holmes seized on the name. And do you know where Miss Penhallow might be found? I believe she married, Drexler said, frowning, but I cannot recall the name. Watson, Holmes said briskly. Tomorrow morning, we shall pay a visit to but tonight see if the directories contain any trace of a Mrs. Penhallow or her married Barry, alias in the vicinity of Paddington or Clerkenwell. And what of the watch? I asked, eyeing the pale paper heart. Holmes smiled faintly. For now, Watson, let it tick inside our thoughts. It is a heart meant not to beat but to remember. Chapter 3. Shadows in Clerkenwell. The following morning found us in Bottenwell, the sun glinting weakly through a veil of London fog. Holmes had risen before dawn, pacing the length of our sitting room like a caged hound. By the time we boarded the early hansom, his energy had condensed into a tightly coiled focus, his every word clipped and precise. That we had obtained from the city directory a most promising lead. An Agatha Penhallow wid, residing in a modest lodging-house on Newcastle Street. Though the surname differed, Holmes had marked the entry with deliberate interest. A widow, he murmured. Convenient, and if not our Miss Penhallow, then a coincidence far too aligned to ignore. The cab dropped us at the junction, where streets narrowed into crooked lanes, and the air grew close with the scent of coal dust and last night's rain. We found the lodging-house quickly enough, a brick structure with weathered shutters and a crooked iron railing. A brass nameplate read, Mrs. Penhallow rooms available. Holmes pressed the bell. It was answered by a tall, angular woman in a heavy housecoat and gloves, though the weather hardly warranted it. Her hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back with Spartan tightness, and her gaze met Holmes with unflinching reserve. Yes, she said. My name is Sherlock Holmes, he said smoothly. This is Dr. John Watson. We're inquiring about a matter involving a mutual acquaintance, one Miss Lillian Hargreaves. For a flicker of a moment, her stern expression wavered, a tightening at the corner of her mouth, the briefest intake of breath. Then composure returned. I have not heard that name in many years, she said. Please come in. We were shown into a parlor of modest size, its furnishings practical but clean. A kettle hissed quietly from the hearth, and a glass cabinet displayed a handful of porcelain birds. Holmes stood before them without touching, his eyes scanning the shelves. Miss Hargreaves and I boarded together, Agatha Penhallow said, once we were seated. In Islington, before she vanished. You knew her well? I asked. We shared a room for nearly a year. I was younger then. She was a bright spirit fond of poetry and flowers, and of folding small hearts out of letters. She trusted to Isley and Mr. Drexler, Holmes asked, his voice carefully neutral. Her lips pressed together. He courted her with intensity, but it was not love. It was possession, though she refused to see it. You did not approve? No, she said simply, and I told her so. She would weep when he raised his voice, and then forgive him the next day. Holmes leaned forward slightly. You said before she vanished. Do you believe she chose to disappear? There was a long pause. She did, she said at last, but not in the way people imagine. And yet, Holmes continued, a watch bearing her mark has been delivered to Mr. Drexler, a watch with a paper heart inside. Miss Penhallow stiffened. I know nothing of it, she said, but if someone is calling her memory back into the world, then they are meddling with ghosts best left undisturbed. Holmes studied her face. And what of her belongings? Were they ever recovered? She left them behind, everything but her handbag, and a small case of letters. Holmes stood abruptly. Mrs. Penhallow, I believe you've told us precisely as much as you mean to, but if you remember anything else, anything at all, please send word to Baker Street. She did not rise to see us out. Back on the street, Holmes' face was unreadable. He lit a cigarette as we turned into the alley behind the lodging house, his eyes scanning each window. "She is concealing something," he said. "Perhaps not malice, but certainly knowledge. You suspect she knows the watch's origin?" Holmes nodded. "At the very least, she suspects. And that veiled reference, not in the way people imagine it, points to something other than death or flight. I shall need to revisit Miss Hargreaves' last known residence." We spent the next hour canvassing the old boarding house in Islington, now turned into a tobacconist's warehouse. Holmes gained access by flashing a card engraved with Lestrade's name, claiming we were investigating a tenant's forged checks. Though the structure had been altered, the original layout was traceable. Holmes noted the position of the windows, the stairwell angles, and the rear exit, then examined the plaster near the fireplace of what had once been the girls' shared room. He crouched suddenly, brushing his fingers over a discolored patch in the wainscoting. "A recent addition," he murmured. "Watson, your pocket knife." With careful hands, Holmes loosened a section of paneling and drew forth a small parcel wrapped in oiled linen. Inside was a dry, cracked envelope addressed in feminine script, to be opened only by E. Drexler. Should I not return? The seal was unbroken. Holmes held it aloft, his eyes narrowing. "It has waited 40 years in silence. But why was it never delivered?" We returned to Baker Street, with the letter secured in Holmes' pocket. Once home, he set it upon the mantel and stood staring at it, as though it were a loaded pistol. "Will you open it?" I asked softly. "No," Holmes said. "Not yet." "Why ever not?" "Because," he replied, "I believe the watch was intended as a summons. This letter was meant to follow, but someone intervened, someone who wished Drexler to receive one message, but not the other." "And you think that someone is still watching?" Holmes turned, eyes sharp. "I would wager they are nearer than we suspect, and that their game has only just begun." Chapter 4. The letter left unread. The letter remained untouched upon our mantel for nearly an hour. As Holmes paced the floor with restless energy, though he had faced murderers and spies without a flicker of doubt, it seemed the fragile envelope addressed to Elijah Drexler unnerved him in a way I had rarely seen. I had settled into my armchair with a book ostensibly I wandered frequently to the envelope and Holmes' shadow drifting back and forth across the hearthrug. At last, I could bear the silence no longer. "You believe the letter to be genuine?" I asked. "I do," Holmes replied without turning. "The paper matches the era. The ink is consistent with domestic formulations common in the early 1870s. More importantly, the handwriting, though HD, is that of a woman unaccustomed to forgery. There is a tremor in the lines, not of disguise, but of fear. And still, you won't read it." He stopped pacing abruptly. "Not I, Watson. This letter was not meant for me, nor for you. Its weight rests on Drexler's conscience and, perhaps, on his past sins." Just then, the bell rang. Mrs. Hudson entered a moment later, looking mildly alarmed. "Gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent." The man who stepped into our sitting room was a curious figure, tall, with pale skin and strikingly sharp cheekbones, dressed in a clerk's overcoat far too thin for the weather. He removed his cap slowly and held it in both hands, eyes scanning the room before settling on Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he said with a trace of uncertainty, "my name is Marcus Fellwether. I work in the record room of the Paddington District Archives." Holmes offered no greeting. Paddington. Interesting. And what has brought a record keeper into the confidence of a detective? Fellwether flushed. I shouldn't be here, truth told, but I recognized the name. Drexler. It's not a common one. Holmes' interest sharpened. "Go on." "I handle death certificates, sir. Old ones, for restoration and copying. We're digitizing the municipal register now. You see, yesterday I was cataloguing files from 1873, and I found one filed in error. I believe marked Drexler, Lillian H., but it was crossed out. The original registrar's ink, clearly visible, had been struck through with a single red line. No cause of death listed, no physician's signature, just her name and avoided status." I leaned forward. "You're saying Lillian Hargreaves' death was registered, then cancelled?" Fellwether nodded. "Exactly that." Dr. Holmes' eyes gleamed. "And where is this record now?" "I made a copy," Fellwether said quietly, removing a folded sheet from his coat. "But please, I shouldn't have taken it. If anyone asks, no one will," Holmes assured him. "You've done the right thing." The young man left soon after, still nervous but clearly relieved. Holmes unfolded the document carefully. The handwriting was faded but legible. Drexler, Lillian H. Date of report, the 3rd of March 1873, filed by Miss Appet. Lodging proprietor status, deceased, struck through amendment, not confirmed, no remains. We sat in silence for a moment. She filed a death report, I said slowly. Miss Penn, and then revoked it. Or, someone did. Holmes tapped his finger thoughtfully on the margin. There's a deeper lie here, Watson. Someone wished the world to believe Lillian was dead, but not so thoroughly as to invite scrutiny. A grave with no body, a death with no confirmation. It suggests choreography, a staged vanishing. He gave a short nod, perhaps even an act of self-erasure. Then who sent the watch? I asked. If not Drexler, if not Penn, if Lillian disappeared of her own will and remains hidden still, who is reviving her memory? Holmes did not answer. Instead, he returned to the mantel and picked up the envelope. He studied it once more, then placed it inside a small leather pouch and tucked it into his desk drawer. You intend to give it to Drexler after all? I asked. I do, but not yet. The timing is delicate. To read that letter prematurely might color his recollections or drive him to action before we're prepared. Action, I said. You believe he may still be a danger? Holmes raised a brow. Or a target. Watson, let us not forget that someone sent him a message designed to unnerve, and now someone else saw the same has removed a second message meant to balance it. That smells of interference. That evening, as Holmes slipped into his overcoat, I rose to follow. Stay, Watson, he said, fastening the top button. I need to walk the East End alone tonight. There are whispers in Limehouse I would rather not subject you to. I frowned. You believe this is connected to the docks? I believe, he said as he pulled on his gloves, that something was carried downriver a long time ago. Perhaps a woman, perhaps a lie. Either way, it will surface. Water has a memory. He paused before closing the door. Keep the fire lit, and Watson, should anything arrive while I'm gone, especially from Clerkenwell, open nothing. Then he vanished into the night, leaving me alone with the unread letter, the broken watch, and the memory of a woman whose paper heart had begun to stir old secrets from the grave. Chapter 5. A stranger beneath the gaslight. I remained by the hearth long after Holmes had departed, the flickering flames casting restless shadows on the parlor walls. Though I had assured him I would open nothing, I could not help but glance every so often at the locked drawer that now held the letter from Lillian Hargreaves. It lay, silent and untouched, like a coiled secret waiting for the right breath to release it. Hours passed in subdued stillness. I attempted to return to Thucydides, but found the ancient text suddenly to dry, its wars and stratagems feeble compared to the subtle battle unraveling just beyond the veil of Holmes' deductions. It was nearing 10 o'clock when the knock came, not the sharp rap of a constable, nor the hesitant knock of a widow. This was a quiet, deliberate tap-tap, measured and strange. I set my book aside, rose from the chair, and opened the door cautiously. A woman stood in the threshold, her coat drawn tight against the spring chill, though no rain had fallen. She wore a plain grey bonnet tied neatly beneath her chin, and a veil shadowed most of her face. She was neither young nor old, her posture straight, her voice refined. Dr. Watson, she asked. I am he, I said. And you are? Her hand trembled as she extended a folded piece of paper. I was told to deliver this to Mr. Holmes, and only to him. But he is not here. He is expected shortly. You may wait inside, if you wish. The woman hesitated, then nodded, stepping over the threshold, like one crossing into sacred ground. She moved with care, her eyes scanning the room as if memorizing each surface. I motioned to the settee, and took the note from her, noting at once that the seal had been broken. Forgive me, I said, but the contents, did you read them? She hesitated. I was not meant to, but I did. Something in her tone, an ache laced with defiance, made me regard her more carefully. She removed her gloves with care, revealing pale fingers adorned with a single ring, a rose-cut garnet in an older Victorian setting. The message was left for Mr. Holmes in Limehouse, she said softly, pinned to the inside of a warehouse door. No name, no address, only this. I unfolded the paper. It contained just 5 words: not buried, not forgiven, return. There was no signature, no indication of origin, but the phrasing echoed something dreadful. Not buried, not forgiven, the very language of the dead. When did you find this? I asked. Less than an hour ago. I was sent to look for it. By whom? She stiffened. He did not give his name. He only said I would know him when the time came. Before I could question her further, Holmes burst through the door with a gust of cold air trailing behind him. His coat was damp at the hem, and a fine dust clung to the folds near his collar. He took in the scene instantly, my posture, the note in my hand, the strange woman seated by the fire end. His eyes narrowed. "You opened the door," he said, "not as an accusation, but a fact." "She brought a message," I replied. "Found in Limehouse." Holmes crossed the room in 2 strides and plucked the paper from my hand. He read it once, then again, then turned to the woman. "You were followed." Her eyes widened. I don't think I know," Holmes said calmly. "There are boot prints in the alley. One man, heavy-set, tried to obscure his tracks by walking in reverse, and yet he failed to account for the smear left by the horseshoe on his left heel. He is stationed 3 doors down, beneath the overhang of the apothecary." I moved to the window and peered into the fog-draped street. Sure enough, a broad figure stood just outside the wash of the gaslight, unmoving. Holmes turned to the woman again. "Tell me everything, quickly." The woman inhaled slowly. "My name was Judith Fallow. I worked as a nursemaid at the Allerton House for Girls in Bow Street. A year ago, a man came asking questions about the girls who had been admitted in the early 1870s. He wanted names, health records, even birthmarks. I told him we kept no records past 10 years. But that wasn't true," Holmes said. "No," she admitted. "We have them still, locked away, and when I opened the old register to see what he might have wanted, I found a name scratched out in heavy ink. It was the only entry ever tampered with. That name was Lillian Hargreaves." My heart gave a lurch. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to me. "Watson, pack the watch, the letter, and the note. We leave within the hour." "Where to?" "To the archive," he replied, "but not the one in Paddington." He turned to Miss Fallow, his tone gentler now. "You have been very brave, Miss Fallow, but you cannot return home tonight. There are those who prefer Lillian Hargreaves remain a myth. Mrs. Hudson will show you a safe room upstairs." As she followed the housekeeper up the narrow stair, Holmes stared once more at the fireplace where the paper heart had rested earlier that week. "Not buried," he murmured. "Not forgiven." He turned, slowly, toward me. "And now, it seems, not gone." Chapter 6. The Name That Vanished Twice. We set out before dawn, wrapped in scarves and silence, the streets of London still hollow with the hush of unawakened lives. Holmes had barely spoken since Miss Fallow had retired upstairs under Mrs. Hudson's care. Whatever he had found or failed to find in the alleyways of Limehouse had pushed him into one of those deep, wordless trances where his mind seemed to burrow inward, racing far ahead of our footsteps. We arrived at the Allerton House for Girls just as the wrought iron gates creaked open for the morning. It was a bleak structure of soot-blotted stone, its facade plain and symmetrical like so many charitable institutions of the time. The windows stared back at us, dim and square and watchful. Holmes showed no badge, no card of introduction. Instead, he pressed the doorbell with quiet purpose, and when the matron answered, an elderly woman with thinning grey hair and a mouth drawn into a line of permanent suspicion, he simply said, "Judith Fallow sent us. We're here about the 1873 register." The matron blinked at him in surprise. "Miss Fallow hasn't worked here for months." "She was here yesterday," Holmes replied, though not in uniform. "And she saw something in your files that you've likely never noticed. I keep our records quite well, I assure you." "Then you won't mind if we see them?" She hesitated. Holmes gave her a faint smile, not warm, but clinical. "It is quite urgent. You see, we're investigating a matter of historical confusion, and it concerns the reputation of your institution." That did it. Within minutes, we were seated in a cold, dust-old office. The matron brought forth an aged ledger from a locked cabinet. Its binding cracked as she opened it before us. Each page bore tidy rows of names, dates, and remarks. It smelled of mildew and chalk. Holmes leafed through with care, until he reached the entries dated between February and April of 1873. He stopped suddenly. "There," he said. I looked over his shoulder. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Names of girls aged 10 to 14. Then I saw it. Halfway down the page, one line had been meticulously scraped away. Not inked over, not blotted, but erased with a scalpel. The surrounding fibers were thinned, the ink trails around it slightly blurred. It was as if someone had sought not merely to conceal the name, but to surgically extract it. Holmes turned to the matron. "Have you any idea who altered this page?" She shook her head slowly. "That section predates my time here, but such tampering would have been a severe offense. Holmes reached into his coat and removed a folded page, the copied death record brought to us by young Fellwether. He laid it beside the ledger, aligning the two. They crossed her out twice, he murmured, once from the rolls of the living, once from the ledgers of the dead. And yet, I said quietly, she exists still in memory, in the watch, in someone's vengeance. Holmes nodded, rising from the desk. Thank you, matron, you've been most helpful. I recommend your cabinet be checked for other tampered entries. You may be harboring more forgotten names than you realize. As we left the institution, the morning had thickened into a pale fog. We said nothing for a time. Then Holmes spoke without turning. There was something else in that ledger. What do you mean? He held up a small slip of paper, which he must have pocketed while the matron wasn't looking. On it were 2 lines in a neat, spidery hand. She came under false name, refused her birth date, sponsored by anonymous benefactor, watch her temperament, refuses prayer, draws hearts in margins. Lillian, I breathed. Holmes nodded. She fled here, not to vanish, but to start again, with someone's help, someone who provided for her anonymity. I frowned. Then that someone may still be alive, still pulling strings, or, Holmes said grimly, they were the first to bury her in lies. We returned to Baker Street to find Mrs. Hudson unusually agitated. That woman, Miss Fallow, she's gone, she said, left in the night. Her bed was unslept and window left ajar. Holmes froze. Did she take anything? Mrs. Hudson looked stricken. Just her coat, and Dr. Watson's satchel. My breath caught. Inside that satchel was the watch, the copied death certificate, and most alarmingly the sealed letter meant for Drexler. Holmes turned on his heel and snatched his coat. She was being followed, Watson, and now she's been taken or fled back to the very man who sent her. You think she was a decoy? I asked, incredulous. I think she knew more than she revealed, Holmes said darkly, and whoever wanted that letter silenced, now has it. We reached Clockenwell by mid-afternoon, and returned to the lodging-house where we had first encountered Agatha Penn. Holmes rang sharply, but the windows were shuttered. The brass plate had been removed. A passing sweep boy told us the house had been emptied that very morning. Moved out like smoke, he said. Didn't even take the coal bucket. Holmes stared up at the windows. 2 women vanish in the span of a night, he muttered, and both tied to Lillian's name. This has ceased to be a case of mourning, Watson. It is a web, a quiet one, and it tightens. What now? I asked. Todd Holmes took a long breath, then said with grim finality, we visit Drexler. He must hear what we've learned, and if someone intends to reach him before we do, they will find us already waiting. He turned, and I followed, the image of the erased name etched into my thoughts. Lillian Hargreaves was no longer merely a memory. She was a match, and someone had just struck her against the past. Chapter 7. A visit to Glassmere. Cab rattled north through streets darkening with approaching storm, the wind teasing the skirts of chimney smoke into long, threadbare fingers. Holmes sat rigid in the corner, his gloved hands pressed together at the tips, a position I had come to associate with the gravest of contemplations. My own thoughts returned repeatedly to Miss Fallow's disappearance and the vanishing of Agatha Penhallow, 2 women linked by secrets, and now both swallowed by them. Elijah Drexler lived in a narrow brick house on Glassmere Lane, a quiet, tree-lined avenue that clung to a faded sense of Victorian dignity. We had sent word ahead of our arrival, and when the housemaid opened the door, she did so with visible relief. He's in the study, gentlemen, she said, eyes flicking past us, but is not himself. We found Drexler seated near the fire, wrapped in a shawl though the room was warm. He looked older than when we had last seen him, his face sunken, his eyes hollow, as if something had been quietly unstitched within him. He rose with difficulty. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming. Holmes wasted no time. Mr. Drexler, we have much to discuss. But first, has anything unusual occurred since our last meeting? Drexler gave a shaky nod. 2 nights ago, someone entered the garden. I heard the gate. By the time I arose, there was no one. But on the stone ledge outside my window this had been placed. He opened a small drawer in his desk and withdrew an envelope, not sealed. Inside was a single photograph, yellowed and creased. Holmes took it gently. The image depicted a young woman seated on a bench in profile, her head turned toward the camera. Though grainy, her face bore delicate features, dark hair, and the unmistakable outline of a paper heart pinned to the bodice of her dress. Watson leaned in. "Is that Lillian?" Drexler whispered. "Or someone who wanted me to believe it?" Holmes studied the photo intently. "This is not a print from 1873. It is a modern reproduction, enlarged from a glass negative, the kind used by portrait houses in Clerkenwell and Holloway during the late 1860s. He turned the photo over. Written faintly in pencil was one word: remorse. Drexler's voice dropped. "Why now, Mr. Holmes? Why am I being haunted after all these years?" Holmes returned the photo. "Because someone is testing your memory, and perhaps your guilt." Drexler drew a slow breath. "I never harmed her. I swear it. I was brash, possessive, perhaps, but I never." Holmes raised a hand. "I am not the judge, Mr. Drexler. But tell me, had Miss Hargreaves ever hinted at fleeing? Did she speak of fear or danger?" Drexler hesitated. "She did once mention a letter she had received. One she refused to show me. It frightened her. She claimed it was a warning, but she would not elaborate. I pressed her, perhaps too harshly. We quarreled that evening. The next day, she was gone." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Then we have, at last, a third actor. Someone who knew her well enough to warn her and, perhaps, hide her. Someone close enough to know your patterns, your temperament." "I was young," Drexler murmured, "and foolish, but I was not the monster they made me out to be." "There is one way we may find the truth," Holmes said, "but it will require your full cooperation." Drexler nodded without hesitation. Holmes removed a bundle from beneath his coat, the broken watch, its paper heart still inside. "Do you recognize this?" Drexler's hands trembled as he received it. "It's hers, or so alike. I cannot tell. She folded these hearts when she was anxious. It was her habit. When she felt trapped." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Then this was not a symbol of affection, but distress." Drexler looked up, startled. "I had never thought of it that way." "There is a deeper message in this return," Holmes said, "and someone wishes you to feel its sting, to confront something long buried. We must make contact with this unseen hand. You propose a trap?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Of a sort." He turned to Drexler. "I will send a note tomorrow to every photography house between Clerkenwell and Holloway, offering to purchase the original negative of this image under your name. The person who delivered the photo will see it, and if they are watching you as closely as I believe, they will respond." "And what then?" Drexler asked, his voice thin. "Then we draw them out," Holmes said, "and they show their face." He tucked the photo carefully back into its envelope. "There is one more matter," he added. "We discovered a letter addressed to you, written by Miss Hargreaves, but it was stolen before we could deliver it. Taken by a woman who may or may not have acted of her own volition. You must understand, someone did not want you to read her words." Drexler paled. "Then she did leave something. All these years." Holmes stood. "I intend to retrieve it, but until then, keep your doors locked. Accept no messages not in your own hand, and should anything further arrive, be it a letter, a token, or a memory, send for me at once." As we stepped back into the gathering dusk, I asked quietly, "Holmes, do you believe Drexler is innocent?" Holmes adjusted his gloves. "I believe he is honest in his grief, but memory is a pliable thing, Watson. It can mourn what it once destroyed." We turned the corner as thunder cracked faintly over the rooftops, and behind us, the house on Glassmere Lane seemed to shrink into itself, its lights dimming like a heart in retreat. Chapter 8. The Woman in Grey. By the following morning, Holmes' message had reached no fewer than 17 photographic establishments across Clerkenwell, Holloway, and Marylebone. Each bore the same curious inquiry, penned in Drexler's own hand at Holmes' insistence, a request to purchase the original negative of a photograph presumed to depict Miss Lillian Hargreaves, taken sometime in the early 1870s. It was a gamble, but Holmes had long wagered that those who dwell in shadows tend to blink when light is turned upon their deeds. We spent the better part of the day indoors, waiting. Holmes drifted between the settee and the windows like a restless shade, occasionally glancing at the street with narrowed eyes. I busied myself in writing up notes on the case, though it felt increasingly like chasing smoke through a sieve. By 4:30, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a note delivered by hand. The envelope bore no stamp or mark, only a single word across its face in careful black script: "Return." Holmes opened it without hesitation. Inside was a folded slip of cream paper, upon which had been written a time and a place. "Tonight, 10 o'clock, Victoria Embankment, near Temple Pier. Come alone. No police, no Drexler, or the letter is lost forever." There was no signature, but in the corner of the page, pressed faintly into the fibers, was the same folded heart crease pattern we had seen before. Holmes turned the note over in his hands, then let it fall lightly to the table. "Tonight, then," he said. "You're not truly going alone," I said firmly. "No," he replied, "but they must believe I do." He paced once across the room. "Watson, I shall meet them under their terms. You, however, will take position along the parapet near the pier. I'll signal if trouble arises." I nodded grimly. "Do you believe they mean harm?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "I believe they mean to preserve their secrets, and when such secrets are tethered to the past, they tend to cut all the looser threads." The hours until nightfall passed slowly. The city churned on around US Street. Organs played faintly. Wheels clattered across cobbles, and far off, the chimes of St. Paul's told out the coming dark. At 10 minutes to 10, Holmes donned his long coat and bowler and slipped a small revolver into the inner pocket. "A precaution," he said, "not a prophecy." By 10 o'clock, we stood on opposite ends of the Temple embankment. The air was crisp, the gaslights glowing pale against the river's oily surface. A few carriages rolled past distantly, their lamps swaying. A steam launch clanked somewhere downriver. Holmes stood near the iron railing, alone in the flickering half-light, his figure cast long across the pavement. I kept to the shadowed curve of the stone wall some 50 paces away, my own revolver snug in my pocket. At precisely 10 o'clock, she appeared. A woman, dressed entirely in grey, stepped out from the shadow of a mooring post. Her bonnet was pulled low, and a veil obscured her face. She moved with careful, deliberate grace, as if walking a balance beam between the past and the present. Holmes did not turn. The woman stopped just behind him, near enough to speak without raising her voice. "You came alone," she said. Holmes' reply was quiet, but I could hear it clearly. As asked, "The letter." She held out a slim parcel. He took it carefully and slipped it into his coat. "You are not who I expected," Holmes said. "You are not Judith Fallow." "No," the woman said softly, "but she served her purpose." Holmes tilted his head. Was she real? She was real enough to follow orders, real enough to vanish when told. And now, "She's safe," the woman replied. "Far from London, as should you be." Holmes turned to face her. "But I am not far from London. I am deep within it, and so are you." She stood her ground. "Let the past rot in the river, Mr. Holmes. It is kinder that way. I am not in the business of kindness." "No," she said. "You're in the business of digging up ghosts." They were silent a long moment. Finally, Holmes said, "The person behind this, behind the watch, the photograph, the games, they're not finished, are they?" The woman's voice dropped. "Not yet." "Then tell me this," Holmes said. "Why now? Why awaken these ruins after 40 years?" The woman turned to the river. "Because the one who buried the truth is dying, and the one who protected it is dead." She began to step backward into the shadows. "Tell Drexler," she said. "He was never the worst of them." Then she was gone, vanished into fog and night. Holmes waited a full minute before moving. He signaled with one hand, and I rejoined him. "Did you recognize her?" I asked. "No," he said quietly, "but I believe she recognized me." He drew the letter from his coat. The seal remained intact. He turned it over, and there, across the back, in faded blue ink, was Lillian Hargreaves' signature. "She wrote this," he said, almost reverently, "and tonight, we read it." He did not open it there. Instead, we turned back toward Baker Street, the city once again shifting around us like a labyrinth of sleeping secrets. But I could feel it in the air, the tension twisting tighter. The letter was real. And somewhere, in its delicate folds, waited the truth that had chased down every player in this story. One paper heart at a time. Chapter 9. The letter unfolds back at Baker Street. The hearth glowed low and steady, casting faint gold across the worn carpets and the edges of Holmes's violin case. Holmes placed the recovered letter on the table between us, with the solemnity of a man laying down evidence at an inquest. The envelope, faded but intact, bore Lillian Hargreaves' name in gentle, slanted script, and just beneath it, in firmer hand, the words, "To be opened only by E. Drexler, should I not return." We did not speak for several minutes. Finally, Holmes reached for a letter opener and sliced through the top edge with surgical precision. He drew out the paper within 3 sheets, folded twice, each corner delicately creased. The ink had browned with age, but the words remained clear. Holmes did not read it aloud at first. His eyes moved quickly, left to right, top to bottom. then returned to the first line. He read it again, slower this time, and I watched the change come over him, not shock, but something quieter and more terrible, a dawning grief for a truth long buried. He handed the pages to me. Elijah, if you are reading this, then I have not come back, and it means that I could not bear to live in that place any longer, between fear and silence. You must forgive me for what I did not say to you, and you must also forgive yourself for what you never understood. There was another man, before you, not one I loved, but one I feared. He was a benefactor to the house in which I was raised, a patron of sorts. He brought gifts. He demanded obedience. The matron pretended not to see. He chose girls he believed no one would miss. He chose me. I was 16. I did not speak of it. Not to you, not to anyone, but he did not forget me. Years later, just as you and I were to announce our engagement, he returned, older, but unchanged. He saw my name in the paper. You had submitted it, remember, and he found me. He threatened to tell you, to ruin everything, or worse. I do not think he would have cast me away, but I could not risk it. My shame was too heavy then, and so I fled. Miss Penhallow helped me. She understood more than I ever said aloud. We staged my departure, left my hairbrush, my diary. I boarded a train under another name. I was taken to a safe place. But safety does not always mean peace. Some names cannot be erased, and some eyes find you even in shadows. If you have this letter, then the past has found you again. I am sorry, but you deserve to know. Not all your pain was deserved, but not all your ignorance was blameless either. I never stopped loving you, but I could not return to a world that would not believe me. Lily and I set the pages down slowly. My throat dry. Holmes said nothing for a while. The fire cracked softly in the grate. Outside, rain had begun to fall in gentle, persistent taps on the window panes. At last, I murmured, "We know." Holmes nodded, though his face remained unreadable. It explains everything. The retreat, the ghostly watch, the warnings, but more than that, what's in it reframes the central cruelty. He leaned forward, fingers steepled. Someone new, someone beyond someone who shielded Lillian, perhaps even took her in and, then, at some point, turned that truth into a weapon. I asked. He shook his head. A pawn, as we suspected. She was used to draw us into the open, but the one behind it, the one who delivered the photograph, sent the note to the pier, and orchestrated the steady rhythm of Lillian's ghost. Returning, they had the letter the entire time. They chose when it would be read. I felt a chill creep through me. To what end? Perhaps to punish Drexler, perhaps to absolve him, or perhaps to prepare the ground for something worse. If they held the letter, they held the story. And when one holds a story, they hold the power of what must be believed. He rose abruptly and crossed to the window. Below, the street was nearly empty. A solitary carriage rolled past, wheels hissing in the wet. "We must return to the beginning," Holmes said. "To the place where Lillian disappeared. The boarding house in Islington. Not the present-day tobacconist, but the foundations beneath it. I believe something was hidden there. The parcel in the wall was not merely forgotten. It was planted, and if someone wanted us to find it, they may have left more." "You think it's a message?" "I think it's a stage," Holmes replied, "and the first act is closing." I watched as he turned from the glass, his face hardening with resolve. "Tomorrow, we dig," he said, "because behind every vanished woman in London, Watson, there is a man who believes silence is owed to him." He paused, then added quietly, "But not this time," as the fire died to a red pulse. I looked once more at Lillian's letter on the table. The folds of her paper heart had finally opened, and what they revealed was not merely a lost love, but a war that had never ended. Chapter 10. Beneath the floorboards came with grey skies and a brittle wind, the kind that seemed to carry with it a warning unspoken. Holmes and I breakfasted in near silence. The letter remained on the mantel, its truth now absorbed but not yet resolved. Holmes examined it once more before slipping it into an envelope marked with Drexler's name. "He'll have it by midday," Holmes said, sealing it, "but not before we visit the place where her voice first vanished." The former boarding house on Strathclyde Street in Islington had long since been converted into a tobacconist's warehouse, its front room stacked with crates and burlap sacks of Virginia blend. Holmes had arranged for a brief inspection with the aid of a forged letter from the Office of Building Safety, claiming we were investigating a suspected dry rot infestation along the foundation. The foreman, uninterested in bureaucratic procedures, handed us a lantern, and left us to our inspection with a shrug. The rear of the building retained elements of the old structure: narrow stairs, warped door frames, a forgotten parlor now used as overflow storage. Holmes passed through each room with hawk-like alertness, running his fingers along seams in the plaster, the iron fixtures, and especially the floor. In the police report, he said quietly, "Miss Penhallow claimed Lillian vanished from her room between 8 and 9 o'clock. No sound, no struggle, no note, only her handbag gone. But if she left under duress, why leave behind every sign of intent? And if she left willingly, why vanish, as though the very floor had swallowed her?" He stopped at the far wall and pressed lightly against the baseboard. There was a faint groan of old timber. Holmes knelt and retrieved a flat tool from his coat pocket, wedging it into the seam between two planks. With a slow creak, one of the boards lifted free. The hollow beneath was dry and dustland, but not empty. Holmes reached inside and withdrew a flat wooden box, no larger than a jewelry case. Its clasp had long since rusted, but the lid gave way under slight pressure. Inside, wrapped in waxed linen, was a small bundle of papers and a curious object, a long-stemmed hatpin with a carved onyx head, shaped into a spiral. I peered at it. An ornament. Holmes turned it over in his hand. "A warning," he said, "or perhaps a mark. Some institutions used such symbols, private signifiers between women. This shape, the spiral, often denoted silence or secrecy in certain underground circles. It may have been passed to Lillian as part of her escape." He unfolded the papers carefully. One was a receipt, dated February 1873, addressed to Miss L. Harwood, a name we had not yet seen, but clearly an alias confirming payment for a train ticket to Oxford and temporary lodging arranged through a women's relief organization. Another was a torn page from a diary, its entry short and breathless. "Miss P. has agreed. I will leave with dawn. Can't sleep, heart aches with relief and fear. Drexler must think I ran from him, but it is not from him I flee. It is from the man at the gate. He came again. He spoke my childhood name. How did he find me? I must become someone else. I will not be a name he owns. My heart is folded." The entry ended mid-sentence. Holmes rose slowly. "This confirms it. She fled under the weight of both fear and pursuit. But the man who haunted her, this benefactor, he knew her name, her history. He watched her across identities. And now," I asked, "do you believe he still lives?" Holmes replaced the lid of the box. "No, but I believe his legacy does, and someone, perhaps a former ally or even a witness, has now chosen to unearth what he'd buried." We replaced the floorboard and exited quietly, Holmes slipping the documents into a satchel beneath his coat. Outside, the street bustled with midday traffic. A fruit vendor shouted beneath a flapping canopy. A dog barked twice at a coal cart. Life, uncaring of secrets, went on. "Whoever planted the box wanted it found," I said, "but only by the right hands." "Indeed," Holmes agreed. "The time, the clues, they've all been laid in sequence, like a musical refrain returning to its origin." He hailed a cab, and we rode in silence for several minutes before he spoke again. "There is one more thread. A name in Lillian's letter, one she never wrote. The man, the benefactor. Do you think she knew it? I believe she did, but she chose not to write it. That omission is telling. She feared even its memory, which means he was not only powerful, but public." We arrived back at Baker Street shortly before 2 o'clock. Mrs. Hudson met us with a telegram. Holmes took it, broke the seal, and read aloud. "Photo negative match found. Original held by retired photographer Charles Breyer. Holloway. Image, titled L. Hargreaves Formal Study. Request to meet at 6. Felder. Holmes folded the telegram with precision. "The final piece may lie with the man who captured her face and perhaps more." He turned to me, his voice low and certain. "Prepare yourself, Watson. We stand on the edge of a name, and names, once spoken, tend not to sleep again." And so, beneath the London fog and the long-forgotten timbers of a vanished girl's hiding place, the last veil was beginning to lift. But we both knew, truths kept in the dark for 40 years do not return without a cost. Chapter 11. The man behind the lens. Hollow echo of the clock striking 6 hung in the air as we arrived at the modest house of Charles Breyer, a narrow residence tucked just off a quiet bend in Holloway Road. The home bore the unmistakable touch of a man who had once worked with precision. Shuttered windows, swept steps, and a brass nameplate polished by routine rather than pride. A lamp glowed faintly behind a lace curtain. the amber light forming a fragile halo against the encroaching dusk. Holmes knocked twice. After a pause, we heard the shuffling of slippers and the rasp of a bolt sliding back. The door creaked open to reveal a thin man in his 70s, his features sharp despite his age, with a full head of white hair and a photographer's steady gaze. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, voice clear but weary. "And Dr. Watson, I presume? Please come in. I've made tea." We stepped into a sitting room that smelled of silver nitrate and mothballs. Framed prints lined the walls, old portraits of solemn women and stiff-backed gentlemen. Beneath them stood a tripod-mounted bellows camera, its body draped with a velvet cloth like a priest in mourning. Briar gestured to 2 chairs beside the hearth, then brought forth a wooden case from beneath a cabinet. It clicked open to reveal a series of glass plates, neatly wrapped and labeled. "I never thought anyone would ask about these again," he said, laying one gently on a velvet cloth. "Especially not that one." Holmes leaned in. "You took this photograph yourself?" Briar nodded. "It was in the spring of '73. She arrived under another name, Harwood, I think, but said little else. Paid in advance. Requested an image that would be quiet. No embellishments. No backdrop. Just her." He paused. There was something unnatural in how still she sat. Not calm. Prepared, as if she knew it might be her last photograph. Holmes picked up a loupe and examined the plate. "She's holding something in her lap," he murmured. "They're just visible beneath her right hand." Briar nodded. "A folded paper heart." She asked that it remained visible. Holmes looked up sharply. "Did she mention why?" "She said it was her name, folded small enough to carry without being caught." A silence settled over the room, punctuated only by the quiet tick of the mantel clock. "There is something else, Mr. Briar," Holmes said, setting down the loupe. "This image, was it ever reproduced?" Shared. Briar hesitated. "Only once. About 10 years ago, a man came asking for portraits of women taken under pseudonyms, specifically around 72 or 73. He claimed to be writing a book on lost identities. I sold him to plates. Hers was one." Holmes' voice hardened. "What was this man's name?" "I didn't catch it," Briar admitted. "But he left a card. Plain, creamstock. No address only. The initials AV and the word Adeline printed below in small type." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Adeline," I frowned. "The name means nothing to me." Holmes was already scribbling the name on the edge of a flyer pulled from the table. "It will, Mr. Briar. May we borrow this plate for a time? We'll return it safely." The old man nodded slowly. "I suppose, after all these years, it belongs more to her story than to my shelf." We thanked him and departed just as the lamplighters passed by, their poles flicking blue flame into the dusk. Once we were safely inside the cab, I turned to Holmes. "You recognized the name?" "I recognized the alias," Holmes corrected. "Adeline is not a name one encounters in London without purpose. It was once tied to a small charitable trust, long defunct, that operated a private residence in Shoreditch, a recovery home for wayward women, as they called it." I sat straighter. "You believe Lillian was sent there?" "I believe," Holmes said grimly, "that someone involved with that home, perhaps a donor, perhaps something more, knew her history, and used it." We arrived at Baker Street as the rain began in earnest, soft and cold. Holmes wasted no time, lighting the lamp and pulling out his files. Within minutes, he had found what he was seeking, a tattered pamphlet from 1872, titled Adeline Home for Ladies in Crisis. The front page bore no list of staff, only a mission statement, signed by a patron, "With compassion and discretion of Vickery." A.V. Holmes said softly, "Our man." He turned the pamphlet to the back and ran his fingers along the lower margin. "Here," he said, "a ledger reference." Watson fetched the registry of charitable holdings from the cabinet. I did so, and Holmes traced the entry with growing intensity. Adeline Trust, dissolved 1876, primary benefactor, Archibald Vick, late of Kentish Town, partner in Vickery and Sons Import Office, surviving heir, Nathaniel Vickery, solicitor. He closed the book slowly. "Vickery," I said. "Was he?" "A quiet man in public records, but one who donated only to institutions without oversight. Homes where discretion was easily bought." I swallowed. "You believe he was the benefactor mentioned in Lillian's letter?" Holmes nodded. "All signs point to it, and the photograph, a relic of her final defiance, leaving behind a truth he couldn't erase. That is why the photo was preserved. That is why someone is reviving this case now. To name him then Nathaniel Vickery may be the final link. Possibly, Holmes said, or the new steward of the old silence. He crossed to the window and stared into the fog. Tomorrow, we pay a visit to Vickery and Sons. He turned back, voice low and cold. Let us see what sins the heirs have inherited. Chapter 12. In the house of Vickery. Next morning arrived with a leaden sky and wind that seemed to whisper through every alleyway with quiet intent. Holmes and I departed at a brisk pace just after 8, foregoing breakfast, save for a cup of black coffee each. His expression was unreadable, but the tightness of his jaw spoke of calculation coiled like a spring dot. Our destination, the offices of Vickery and Sons, situated in a pale sandstone building along Bouverie Street, near the legal district. A brass plaque near the door confirmed the firm still operated under the Vickery name, though Holmes remarked that Archibald's son, Nathaniel, had long since taken over the practice. That as we entered, a young clerk greeted us from behind a writing desk with a practiced, polished smile. "Good morning, gentlemen. How may I direct you?" "We have an appointment with Mr. Vickery," Holmes said smoothly. The clerk blinked. "May I ask the nature of your business?" "Historical inquiry," Holmes replied, "of a personal and discreet nature." The clerk disappeared into a back hall. Moments later, he returned and gestured for us to follow. We were led into a room of dark wood, green drapes, and low light. Behind a desk sat Nathaniel Vickery, a man in his late 50s, trim, composed, and dressed with the elegance of inherited money. His mustache was narrow and silver, and his fingers were long, ringless, and still. "Mr. Holmes," he said, standing, "and Dr. Watson, I've read your name often enough in the Gazette. What can I assist you with?" Holmes took the seat offered. "Your father, Archibald Vickery, was a noted benefactor to several institutions in the 1870s, one in particular the Adeline Home for Ladies in Crisis." Nathaniel's expression tightened for just a moment. "That's an odd piece of history to resurrect. The home closed generations ago." "Indeed, but its shadows remain." Nathaniel sat back, steepling his fingers. "May I ask what prompted your inquiry?" Holmes reached into his coat and produced the photograph of Lillian Hargreaves. He placed it on the desk, face up. "Do you recognize this woman?" Nathaniel glanced at it, but made no effort to study it. "I do not," he said. "She was a resident at Adeline, Holmes said, shortly after fleeing the attentions of a man who once funded the home, a man who used his position to select girls." Nathaniel's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes flickered just briefly. "My father was a man of means," he said carefully. "He gave too many causes. That he supported a struggling home is hardly evidence of wrongdoing." "No," Holmes said quietly, "but the women who vanished from those homes are..." Vickery's lips thinned. "These are serious accusations, Mr. Holmes. One's better directed at ghosts than sons." "And yet," Holmes said, "you were the one who purchased the photograph from Mr. Breyer 10 years ago, under the initials A.V. That struck its mark." Vickery looked down at the photo neutrally looked. "I didn't know her name then," he said, his voice lower now. "Only that my father had written checks to the home during that year, and I had seen him with girls, younger than appropriate. I was still a student. He claimed they were charity cases, waifs." "But you doubted him," I said. "I did. After his death, I found records, names, payments to matron-led institutions in Bow Street, in Shoreditch, all under his private ledger. He kept them out of the firm's accounts." "And Lillian?" Holmes asked. "I didn't know her story," Vickery admitted, "but I wanted to know the truth. When I found her image among the photographer's old plates, I felt something had followed her all her life, even in her stillness." Holmes regarded him steadily. "And now I know who she was, and I know what he did." There was a moment of silence. Then Holmes drew out the folded letter and placed it beside the photograph. Lillian's letter, addressed to Elijah Drexler, hidden for decades and nearly destroyed to preserve your father's silence. Vickery swallowed. "She was afraid of him," Holmes continued, "and she wasn't the only one, but someone has kept her memory alive, dropping tokens, sending messages, guiding us to this very moment." Vickery gave a slight nod. "Yes, I believe that someone was Agatha Penhallow." Holmes sat forward. "You knew her?" "We corresponded briefly, years ago. She contacted me when I began my search. She warned me not to publish, told me the damage was already done, but that Drexler deserved the truth. I agreed to wait, to watch. She said when the time came, I would know. And now you do," Holmes said. Vickery exhaled slowly. "Then tell me, Mr. Holmes, what am I meant to do with this knowledge?" Holmes's reply was quiet but firm. See that her story is told not in scandal sheets, but in the records. Give her name back its place. Clear the errors. Uncross the struck through entries. Restore what was taken. And Drexler, he will live with the truth, Holmes said. As must you. Nathaniel Vickery sat for a long time in silence, staring at the photograph. At last, he said, then let it begin. Her name shall be written, and this time, it will not be erased. As we left the office, the weight in the air did not lift but shifted. A page had not yet turned, but the pen had touched parchment. Lillian Hargreaves, lost girl, folded heart, buried name was returning to the light, and the men who thought silence eternal had begun to feel the cost of memory. Chapter 13. Echoes at Kensal Green. 2 days passed. During that time, Nathaniel Vickery acted with surprising haste and resolve. Holmes received a brief but deliberate note from the solicitor. The Adeline Holmes disbanded registry had been submitted to the Historical Archives at Gray's Inn, along with a private addendum authored by Vickery himself, an acknowledgement of the abuses enabled by his father's unchecked patronage. Lillian Hargreaves' name, long erased, had been formally restored in the surviving institutional ledgers, and Elijah Drexler had read the letter. Holmes did not permit me to attend the reading. He insisted it be private, unclouded by sympathy or judgment, but afterward, Drexler sent a short message of thanks, in handwriting more fragile than before. It read only, "The weight is clearer now, not lighter, but no longer shapeless." We assumed the matter drawing toward its end, but on the third morning a telegram arrived. It bore no sender's name, only a place and an hour. Kensal Green Cemetery, 4 o'clock, alone, bring nothing, ask nothing, observe. Holmes showed me the telegram at breakfast, eyes narrowing as he folded it. "I believe," he said quietly, "we are not quite finished." The air was brittle and grey by the time we arrived at the cemetery. Holmes did not dress in disguise that afternoon, only in his long coat and black gloves. He insisted we carry no bag, no camera, and no means of defense. "This is not a trap," he said. "It is an epitaph." We passed through the cemetery gates just before 4, our boots crunching over wet leaves. The stone angels and moss-darkened obelisks loomed around us, guardians of the forgotten. I followed Holmes down the narrow gravel path until we arrived at Lillian Hargreaves' symbolic grave, the one we had visited weeks before. This time, it was not empty. A woman stood beside the grave, her gloved hand resting gently upon the headstone. She wore a charcoal cloak and a deep grey hat, the same shade as the mist curling through the branches. Above her, though her face was veiled, there was no mistaking the stillness. The poise, the same presence we had encountered at Temple Pier, the woman in grey. Holmes made no move to confront her. He merely stopped a respectful distance away and waited. After a moment, she spoke. "It is done." Holmes inclined his head. "The records, the name. Drexler has read her words. So has Vickery. And now," she said softly, "she may rest." "Truly." He studied her a moment. "You knew her well." "I did." "Were you with her in the end?" She was silent for a moment. Then she nodded. "She lived longer than they expected. She changed her name twice more, but eventually, London found her. The past has a long stride. She died not from fear but from the quietness that comes after it." Holmes stepped closer. "And you?" "I protected what she could not. Her memory, her voice, the truth she could not bear to name outright." Holmes said nothing. She continued. "Miss Pennilow kept watch for a time. Then others took the burden. I was one of them. We left the watch for Drexler not to torment, but to begin. Everything that followed your steps, your questions, was meant to deliver the letter when the world was ready to believe it. I found my voice at last. And what becomes of her now?" The woman turned slowly to the grave. "This stone was always a lie, a placeholder for shame. Now it may serve as something else." Holmes followed her gaze. Beneath the original inscription, she wandered beyond our reacher. New line had been etched, barely visible in the fresh stonework. "Her name endures." Holmes studied the engraving a moment longer. Then, quietly, he said, "You never told us your name." The woman turned back to him, the veil still drawn low. "You never asked." And then, without further word, she stepped back into the mist. Within seconds, her figure dissolved behind a row of ivy-choked monuments, leaving us with only silent soundstone. Holmes remained still for a long time, his gaze resting on the new inscription. When we finally turned to leave, I asked, "Do you believe she was telling the full truth?" "No," Holmes replied, "but I believe she told enough." The gates of the cemetery creaked shut behind us. The wind was colder now, though the sky had not changed. As we emerged onto Harrow Road, Holmes paused. "We often solve cases, Watson," he said, "but rarely do we close them." He looked back once more toward the graves. "This one, I believe we've buried with care." And we walked on, the city folding round us once, againlessly shifting, but now carrying, at last, a name that had been rescued from silence. Chapter 14. The second. Watch week passed in unusual quiet. Holmes resumed his customary routines, perusing obscure monographs on Egyptian ciphers, setting fire to old notes in the hearth, and playing the violin with long, wandering phrasing that told me his mind was not entirely at peace. I, for my part, occupied myself with clinic duties and correspondence, though a persistent sense of something unfinished lingered beneath the surface of my thoughts. It was on the 8th evening, just after dusk, that our silence was broken once more. A knock came at the door, not urgent, but deliberate. Mrs. Hudson brought in a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper, with no name or return address. Holmes sat up immediately, his gaze sharpening. "There," he said, "the echo." He unwrapped the package with care, revealing a box identical in shape and size to the one we had recovered beneath the floorboards in Islington. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a second watch. Holmes held it in his palm. The casing was tarnished silver, older than the first, but unmistakably of the same make. He opened the cover. Beneath the glass lay another paper heart, this one folded more crisply, as though more recently made, and beneath the heart, not a broken movement like the first, but something else entirely. "A key," I breathed. "A winding key." Holmes turned it slowly in his fingers. "This watch is not broken. It is waiting." He closed it and set it gently on the table between us. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Then I said, "What does it mean?" Holmes stared into the fire, the flames flickering over his face. "It means," he said slowly, "that someone else has something to say." He reached into the box once more and drew out a folded sheet of paper. Upon it, typed in precise spacing, was a single sentence. "You have heard her voice. Now, listen to ours." There was no signature, only a set of initials printed faintly in red ink at the bottom corner. C.H.S. Holmes frowned. "That's not a person. It's a title. A society, possibly, or a group. One with structure." The color red ink was common among certain advocacy circles in the 1880s, most notably the Camberwell Home Society. I blinked. "That name, it's familiar." "It should be," Holmes replied. "Camberwell was once a refuge for women disowned by family or law, particularly those who left behind powerful men. Their records were buried after a fire in 1891, but rumors persisted that they continued under another guise, a hidden network." He tapped the edge of the paper. "This may be their voice. But why now?" I asked. "Why the second watch?" "Because," Holmes said, lifting the timepiece again, "Lillian's story was not singular. It was emblematic. There are others, perhaps many, and this," he wound the watch once. It clicked softly, "is not the end of one case. It is the beginning of something wider." The room felt suddenly heavier, as if time itself had paused to consider what was being asked of us. The ticking resumed, slow and deliberate, each beat a quiet challenge. "I fear," Holmes murmured, "that we were only ever walking the perimeter of a larger design." I sat back, troubled. "And this group CHSU think they intend to involve you further?" "I think," he said, "they already have." He rose, walking to the bookshelf. From the uppermost row, he removed a folio of old cases unsolved, incomplete, or quietly dismissed. He placed it on the desk, flipping through yellowed pages. "Women vanished," he muttered. "In the East End, in Southwark, in Limehouse, most dismissed as flight, as poverty, as madness." He paused at one clipping, a small notice about a girl found in Stepney, unnamed, with no identifying documents. Another of a woman committed to an asylum under false testimony, whose testimony had been stricken from the record. "They were all folded away," he said, "like paper hearts." He turned back to the watch. "Someone is daring us to listen." Outside, the wind had begun to rise, pressing against the windows with soft insistence. The fire popped in the grate, casting sparks into the dark. Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We were asked to observe, Watson. Now, I believe, we are being asked to remember, to make something unforgettable. "And if we refuse?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Then another watch will arrive, and another, until the silence is filled." He wound the second watch fully and placed it on the mantel beside the first. Together, they ticked out of sync, one older, one newer, both alive, and in that quiet, rhythmic defiance, I understood what Holmes had already begun to see. Lillian Hargreaves had not simply left behind a story. She had passed on a legacy, one that, even now, was ticking toward a reckoning. Chapter 15. Threads in the Dust. By morning, Holmes had already dispatched telegrams, one to the remnants of the Gray's Inn archive office, and another, more oblique, to a former contact in the Home Office who, Holmes assured me, owed him a favor, or at least a few nights' sleep. The two watches sat on the mantel, ticking side by side, like dueling unresolved, yet somehow unified in their dissonance. Holmes had taken to calling them the first voice and the echo. He logged their markings, balance weights, even the slight inconsistencies in the movement of the second hands. But it was the paper hearts that held his attention most. "These folds," he said, holding the newer one up to the morning light, "are different. Do you see?" I took it gently, careful not to damage the fine creases. "Tighter at the base," I noted. "Sharper edge. Someone more practiced." Holmes nodded. "Exactly. The first heart was symbolic, made in fear or remembrance. This one was instructional, a signal. It follows the folding pattern of the Kimball cipher." I blinked. "Which he taught to a member of Scotland Yard 5 years ago, during the Ashcroft affair, and which has since surfaced only in underground correspondence between 3 groups," he added. "2 political, 1 philanthropic." CHS Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely. They are not merely whispering, Watson. They are organizing." That afternoon brought a response to one of the telegrams, a small envelope delivered by hand, sealed with a red wax emblem. Inside was a single sheet bearing the crest of Gray's Inn Library, and a note: "Inquiry received. Incomplete registry of Adaline patrons found burned along edges. One surviving leaf lists donations from a vicary, C. Hargrove, and E. Redstone. See attached tracing." Holmes turned the page. I watched his brow furrow as he scanned the faded list. "Redstone," he murmured. "That name again. I had heard it once before, early in our investigation on a tenant record near the old boarding house. Connected?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "The house 2 doors down from Lillian's residence, rented briefly in '73 by an Elias Redstone, listed as a shipping clerk, but he was no clerk." He turned to the files and retrieved an older case, folded dusty and never closed. "Redstone was a courier, and not for anything so ordinary as parcels. He moved information-sealed letters, bank dockets, identification slips. He had no permanent address. He worked quietly, behind men of louder reputations. The kind of man a powerful benefactor might use to erase a name." Holmes drew out a faded photograph. A gaunt man in a dark coat, narrow eyes, thin lips. A penciled note beneath it read, "Last seen 1884. Vanished following inheritance scandal in Croydon." If Redstone was involved with Adaline, Holmes said, it was not as a donor. He was the one carrying secrets from place to place, possibly including Lillian's escape route, or even her final disappearance. I felt a chill return to the room. Then he knew where she was, and he may have told someone else. Holmes added, "That knowledge passed forward, buried. Then, unearthed may now be the very lever CHS is using to expose the system that kept her silent." He rose and fetched a coat from the rack. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To Redstone's last address. If his name was tied to Adaline and that boarding house, someone may have kept a record of what he left behind. A clerk with no family, no title. His belongings would have been boxed, stored, or sold. Perhaps not all of it was meaningless." We took a cab to Hanbury Street, the last recorded residence of Elias Redstone. The building had been converted into a linen merchant's office, but Holmes persuaded the proprietor to let us examine the cellar beneath, for gas line concerns. As he explained, entirely deadpan, the cellar was cramped and lined with dust-caked crates. The merchant handed us an oil lamp and left us to our work. Holmes set to searching with the practiced method of a man accustomed to finding clues where only rot remained. We sorted through crates of forgotten ledgers, old receipts, ink bottles, and moth-eaten coats. But in one narrow crate tucked in the farthest corner, Holmes froze. He drew out a small wooden box, sealed with wax that had long since cracked. Inside, beneath faded documents, lay a folded cloth, and wrapped within it, a metal case. Another watch, but this one was different. Holmes opened it slowly. It bore no paper only a brass disc beneath the cover, inscribed with the phrase, "For the one who never folded, E.R. Redstone's," Holmes murmured, "and this is no timepiece." He turned the disc. It clicked. One hand sprang open like a locket. Inside was a small photograph, a woman, mid-30s, eyes direct, expression unafraid. She did not look like Lillian Hargreaves. She looked stronger, determined. N behind the photo, tucked flat against the case's inner lid, was a list of names. 20-6, by Holmes' count. Women's names, some familiar, some unknown, each paired with a date, a place, and a single letter, S, V, D. A dot. Holmes stared down at it. "A record," he said. "A ledger of vanishing." The voices folded away. He held it as if it were a verdict. Redstone was no eraser. He was an archivist, and someone, perhaps even CHS, retrieved this ledger from the dark. I leaned forward. "What does it mean?" Holmes closed the case carefully. "It means we've been handed not a case, but a chronicle." And Watson, he met my eyes, something rare flickering behind his usual calm. "We are no longer solving one mystery. We are walking through the ruins of many." Above us, the wind howled faintly against the coal-smeared bricks, and I felt it again, that sense that time was not only passing, but circling. One name had risen, and now, behind it, 100 more waited to be remembered. The second watch had ticked, the third had spoken, and the dust would no longer settle. Chapter 16. Names in the margin. Back at Baker Street, the brass case from Redstone's cellar lay open upon Holmes's desk, like an unearthed confession. The list it contained had already been copied twice, once by Holmes, once by me, and even now he worked on matching the initials beside each woman's name to any pattern he could devise. "What do you make of the letters?" I asked, glancing at the columns again. "S, V, D. They appear at random." "Not random," Holmes replied, tracing a line across the page, "but coded by purpose. Look here, Sarah Ellingham, S. Poplar, 1872. Then Adeline Moorcroft, D. Bow, 1874. Then Catherine Bray, A. Holloway, 1873. He tapped the list thoughtfully. The dates, the locations, they aligned too closely with institutions we know operated under the veil of women's rehabilitation. Adeline Camberwell, Northmoor House. Each operated quietly, each with patrons whose names faded from record, and each with girls who were never seen again. "So these initials," I said slowly. "Categories," Holmes concluded, "likely denoting the reason or method of disappearance. S for silenced, D for disappeared, A for asylum, V ... He paused, his brow darkening. ... May denote those turned over to specific individuals, likely benefactors. I swallowed. Traded, bartered, Holmes corrected grimly, with bureaucracy as the coin. He rose from his desk and crossed to the hearth, folding his arms. Redstone kept this list not as a tool for extortion, but as a record, a ledger of loss. This was his silent rebellion, his penance, perhaps. "And now," I said, "someone means for you to carry it forward." Holmes turned slowly. "Yes, CHS did not place this in our hands by accident. We were led to the boarding house, to Briar, to Vickery, and, finally, to this. This third watch is not a call to solve a crime. It is a summons to expose a pattern, and to decide whether silence is a safer legacy than justice." He retrieved the watch once more, and lifted the photograph concealed within. "The woman with the direct eyes and the plain dress. Her name is on the list," he said. "Number 11. Margaret Danton S. Wapping, 1873. No known family. Taken in under a false name. Never emerged." I stared at the image. "But this woman is not erased. She's defiant, indeed, which suggests something curious." Holmes retrieved the earlier photograph of Lillian Hargreaves from the mantelpiece. "Look, here, compare the tilt of the jaw, the eyes. Not identical, but perhaps siblings." I leaned closer. The resemblance was subtle, but unmistakable. Holmes' voice lowered. If Margaret was related to Lillian, perhaps a half-sister, or cousin, then her disappearance would not merely be a tragedy. It would be the first thread in a web that ultimately pulled Lillian into the hands of Vickery and his circle. He tapped the photograph. "Redstone was closer to this than we imagined. And if someone is continuing his work," I asked, "then they're sending us proof, and inviting us to name the system, not just the men." Just then, a knock sounded on the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes opened it silently, scanned it, and passed it to me. To Holmes. You have the names. Come see the places. Bring no cabrice. Bring only trust. Eastgate House, midnight. CHS. Holmes folded the telegram slowly. Eastgate House, he said, derelict since 1890, originally a textile mill, later converted into a lodging refuge for displaced women, closed after a fire, rumors of mismanagement, and worse. You intend to go, I said flatly. Holmes nodded. They've withheld their identities long enough. If they want to show us what remains, we must be prepared to see it. And if it's a trap, he offered a dry smile. Then we go well dressed. As the hour approached midnight, Holmes dressed in his black coat and he-collared scarf. I followed suit, revolver concealed beneath my vest. We took no cab, moving quietly through the misted lanes of Whitechapel and into the grimier corners of the East End. Eastgate House loomed at the end of an alley, like a monument to forgotten intentions. Its facade was cracked, the shutters rotted through, a single lamp burned behind a curtained upper window. Holmes motioned for silence and stepped forward, pushing the iron gate open with a groan. We entered through a side door already ajar, its hinges recently oiled. Inside, the smell of dust and old soot clung to every surface, and then, down the hall, a lantern flickered to life, held by a woman in a dark cloak. It was the same woman from Temple Pier, the woman in grey. You came, she said. Holmes inclined his head. You left no doubt we must. She turned and began walking without further word. We followed her through narrow passages until we reached a broad, open room, perhaps once a dining hall or assembly area. At its center stood a long wooden table, covered in worn ledgers, photographs, and case slips. Arranged around it stood a dozen others, women of varied age and bearing, some in widow's dress, others in work coats or plain shawls. Holmes took in the scene. CHS, he said. The woman in grey gave a slight nod. Not a title, a vow. Then you are not one, Holmes said quietly, but many. Yes, she said, and this is what we have kept, what no institution dared to acknowledge. The names, the ledgers, the hidden corridors. Lillian was only the beginning. Redstone was one of us. So was Agatha Penhallow. She stepped closer, lowering her veil. For the first time, I saw her face clearly lined, wise, unashamed. Her hair was streaked with grey, her eyes sharp as the fire in the hearth behind her. We do not ask you to solve these cases, she said. We ask you to carry them, to show them, so that they may no longer be folded away. Holmes looked down at the watch in his hand. Then he looked at the table, at the names. And he nodded. Then we begin, he said, with the one's time thought forgotten. Chapter 17. The tune that could not end the weeks that followed moved with the quiet gravity of an incoming tide. The names from Redstone's list 26, in total, were carefully transcribed, their fates investigated, and, where possible, recorded in the public archive. Some were found in asylum records buried under false diamonds. Others reappeared in death registries as unclaimed. A few had no trace beyond the single letter beside their names. Holmes devoted himself wholly to the task, with a level of focused solemnity I had rarely seen. Even in our most dangerous cases, there were no dramatic confrontations, no arrests, only silence slowly giving way to recognition. Vickery, true to his word, had begun dismantling the legal structures that had shielded his father's name. With Holmes' aid, he prepared a statement for the record, one that would appear not in the news sheets, but in the legal annals and charitable records, where men of stature could not look away. It read, in part, we inherit not only wealth but memory. The failure to speak does not absolve the harm that silence enables. Let this name, and those it buried, be brought to light. Lillian's grave, once symbolic, now bore not just her name, but her history. Her true date of death was etched beneath the original inscription, discovered through records in a rural infirmary near Wiltshire, where she had lived her last quiet years under an assumed name, Margaret Bell. She had become a teacher. Her final journal, Past 2C, described her students, the flowers they brought her in spring, and a hope that someone, someday, might know her story. Holmes and I stood again at Kensal Green as the new headstone was placed. Lillian Hargreaves, 1852 to 1898. She lived quietly and was erased loudly, but her voice was never truly lost. Beneath that was one final line, folded but not broken. Neither of us spoke for a time. When we returned to Baker Street, the mantel still bore the 3 watches each, carefully wound. each still ticking. Holmes regarded them as he removed his gloves. "We never found who folded the first heart," he said. "Not definitively." "No," I agreed, "but we found who unfolded it." He sat by the fire, steepling his fingers. "In most cases, Watson, we arrive at a singular truth. One culprit, one revelation. But here, there were many," I said, "each truth unlocking the next." Holmes nodded slowly. "There is a term in music, a repeated phrase that underlies the entire composition. It is never the melody, never the most beautiful line, but it is the structure, the thing that never stops." He glanced toward the watchers. Lillian was the her silence ran beneath decades, beneath other disappearances, other injustices, and when that tune began again, we could not ignore it. He fell quiet, then added, almost as an afterthought, "They've sent more names." I looked toward the side table. There, neatly stacked, was a new enveloped seal marked with the red letters of CHS. "You'll follow them." He gave a slight smile. "No, Watson, we will." The fire crackled. Outside, the city moved, as it always had, unaware. But now, somewhere in its deepest corners, the records had changed. A ledger once scribbled in shadows now bore names. The graves once symbolic now told the truth. And the case once thought unsolvable had spoken at last. I took my seat by the hearth. Holmes poured tea without a word. As the three watchers ticked one after another, never quite in sync, I realized what I had been hearing all along. Not the end of a case, but the echo of one voice, carried forward by others, and still unfolding.